In this video, we'll show you how to install a high-performance Rockford Fosgate audio system on a Harley-Davidson motorcycle. Welcome back. I'm Eric, and today we're going to install an HD14CVO-STAGE2 on this Street Glide CVO. The first thing we need to do is make sure we have the bike flashed by an authorized Rockford Fosgate dealer. We have a list of dealers that can flash on our website. The factory radio contains an excessive EQ curve that's preset by the factory. Now this is fine for an OEM setup, but with a high-performance aftermarket system like the one we're going to put on here, we need to get rid of that EQ curve. This will allow you to experience the full potential of the audio system. We'll get started by removing the seat and a 10mm socket to disconnect the battery negative. Now we're ready to remove the fairing. First, we'll install the surface cover on the fender. Then we'll use a T27 Torx driver to remove 4 bolts on the inside and 3 bolts that hold the visor in place. Now, it's best to have 2 people for this step, one to hold the fairing in position and the other to remove the screws. Once we pull down on the fairing, we'll disconnect any harnesses and remove it. Now that we have the fairing off, you'll notice there's a boom audio amplifier that we need to remove. To get started, we'll use a T20 Torx driver to remove 2 screws holding the upper vent in place. Then we'll use a 7/16 socket to remove 2 nuts from the right side of the boom amp, the L bracket. Slide the amplifier out from the 2 pins holding it in on the opposite side. Then use the same T20 Torx to remove 4 screws that hold down the boom amp bracket. Now we're ready to remove our speaker pods. We'll start by disconnecting the harnesses on top using a flathead screwdriver and plastic removal tool. Then we'll use a 5/32 ball head Allen to remove 2 screws from the top of each pod. Then we'll move down and remove 3 bolts from the lower inside of the forks using a 7/16 socket with a swivel joint and extension. Now these 3 bolts are difficult to get to, so we recommend detaching 2 plastic rivets from the lower harness panel using a No. 1 Phillips to give you some extra space. Finally, we'll use a 3/16 Allen to remove 3 screws from the outer side of the pods. Now we're ready to remove our factory equipment and install our new speakers. As you could see, when we removed our speaker pods, there were some additional harnesses to remove. The TMS65 speakers included in your kit contain extra grills for road glide and tour pack installs. For our batwing fairing, we're going to use this grill with the 3 tabs. We'll start by using a T25 Torx and remove 3 screws holding the factory grill in place. We'll use the same hardware to secure our new ones in place. Take note, when installing, that the logo will reside at the bottom. We'll use the same T25 to remove 4 screws from the speaker pod and install the new speaker with the logo toward the bottom as well. Now after that's done, we'll use a 3/16 Allen driver to secure the 3 outer screws and hold the pods in place. Before we move on to the next step, we'll go ahead and finish attaching our speaker pods and reattach the wiring harnesses, including the lower harness panel. Now we're ready to install our amp bracket. First, we'll stick on 4 included standoffs over the holes where the amp mounts. Now these are very important because it isolates heat generated from the amplifier and prevents it from transferring to the other electronics. Then we'll position the bracket with the heatsink fins facing the front. Using the supplied hardware and a 3mm Allen driver, secure the screws using the holes labeled 2014 Plus Street Glide. Now that we're done with that, we're ready to tune our amplifier and install it. We offer a free amp tuning guide that's available in the description of this video and through this kit's product details page at rockfordfosgate.com. Once we get the amplifier configured, we'll secure it to the amp bracket using the supplied hardware and a 2.5mm Allen driver. Before proceeding, be sure to remove the pre-installed power connector since our harness already has one. Now that we have that done, we're ready to remove the gas tank. We'll start off by disconnecting the electrical harnesses and pulling 2 breather lines in the back. Note that they may be zip tied underneath. Next, using a shop rag, we'll disconnect the gas line. Push up on the hose and while sliding the fitting upward, pull down on the gas line. Once that's done, detach the 2 rubber boots from both sides of the front of the gas tank and use a 1/2-inch socket to remove 2 bolts. Then, use the same socket to remove the 2 bolts in the back. Alright, now that we have access to the center channel, we're ready to install our power harness. First, cut any zip ties off and unsnap the center harness cover. Once that's done, we'll take the power connector side of our harness and run it up the clutch side of the motorcycle. Then we'll use a small Phillips driver to unscrew a plastic rivet that holds a retaining bracket in between the forks. We'll route our harness through this bracket and up to the amplifier. making sure that you have enough slack to make your amplifier and battery connections. Simply plug the power connector into the amplifier and plug the blue wire into an empty connector on the top of the brake side. This blue wire is the amplifier remote turn-on. Take note that there is likely an empty plug that needs to be removed before making your connection. Now that we're done with that, we're ready to replace our bag lid speakers. Using a T20 Torx driver, remove the 4 screws from the inside of the bag lid speaker housing. Hold the grille in place while removing the last screw. Then, remove the 4 screws holding the factory 5x7 and detach both plugs. Now we're ready to install our new TMS57 speakers. First, orient the terminals in the same direction and plug in the connector. Then, using the same hardware, install the new 5x7 and speaker grille. We've also included some new rebadge kits that cover the HD logos. Alright, now we're ready to install our T-harness. This is an all-new design with some cool features. First, we'll disconnect the main harness from the back of the factory source unit. Push the little catch pin in that locks the harness in place and slide the lever open. Plug this end into the female end of our T-harness and lock it into place. Then plug the male end of our T-harness into the source unit and slide the lever until you hear it click. Take the harness labeled amp input and connect them to the corresponding front and rear input jacks on the amplifier. Then, take the harness labeled amp output and connect the corresponding front and rear output jacks to the amplifier. Now we'll show you how to bypass the factory amplifiers so we can use our TM400X4AD. First, take 2 plugs from your amp mounting kit labeled Boom Amp Bypass. Now newer versions of these plugs will be labeled CVO 4-speaker Boom 2. Plug 1 bypass into the harness we originally moved from the factory amp under the fairing. Then, inside our left bag lid, detach the wiring harness from the second factory amp and insert the other bypass plug into the harness. Alright, now that we're done with that, we're ready to make our battery connections. We'll use a 1/2" socket to remove 2 screws that hold the engine control module in place. We'll disconnect a couple harnesses, flip the ECM tray up, and make our positive terminal connection. Then we'll reconnect our negative cable with our amp ground. Once that's done, we'll go ahead and put everything back in place. Now we're ready to clean up our wiring. You'll likely notice some extra wires in our T-harness and in the kit. This allows you to use our DSR1 digital signal processor. For more information, download our DSR1 setup guide for Harley-Davidson and keep an eye out for a complete configuration video we'll be releasing in the future. Now, since we're not using the DSR1 on this motorcycle, we'll zip tie this blue wire that's used with the processor. In the configuration on this particular motorcycle, the amplifier is running a 4 ohm load per channel. However, it's designed to operate at 2 ohms. Because of this, we're going to pre-install these additional Y adapters that split the front and rear outputs of the amp. This gives you the option to install lowers on the front as well as tour pack speakers on the rear. Alright, now that we have everything cleaned up, we're ready to reassemble the bike and test the system. I want to reiterate, before testing, make sure that the factory radio is flashed. Regarding maintenance and durability of the system, we get a lot of questions about getting the speakers wet. Now, they are element ready, so they can withstand water, dust, and UV rays. However, avoid using a pressure washer on the bike, and be sure to close the vent to help prevent water from getting inside the fairing. This will protect your amplifier and all your electrical components. As you can see, that install was pretty straightforward. If you prefer to have a professional do the install for you, we have a network of authorized Rockford Fosgate dealers that can be found on our website. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to contact our technical support. They can be reached Monday through Friday at 1-800-669-9899 or through live chat at the bottom of our website at rockfordfosgate.com. Until next time, I'm Eric, and we'll see you again soon.